This all leads into a very low quality life experience for the ego. It's not like an ego is having a great time. It's very stressful for an ego. It has very little capacity to generate its own good mood, its own good emotions, its own good thoughts, its own good feelings. Hi guys, how's it going? Welcome to Going Dotty. I'm Trace Egan, and in today's video we're going to be imagining what life is like for an ego. So I thought it might be just quite interesting to turn the perspective again and have a look and a consideration at what life is probably like for an ego. You know, when we're dealing with egos, when we're struggling with the ego in our life, when we're having to be the counterbalance to the ego in other people, it's very difficult, and it's very easy for us to lose our narrative to the negativity and reflect the negativity that they are bringing forward in our life and in our world. So I think it's a very useful tool to highlight the other side of the spectrum, because for us to be operating in lack or in a closed grid towards egos is really a repetition of the same pattern that the ego itself puts out there. The ego, like all people, they have dreams and they have visions. They have things that they want to achieve. They have a life that they want to live. They have a way that they want things to be. And that is no different really from anybody else. What happens for an ego is the ego doesn't actually know how to embody and hold itself as the creative being that it is, as the sovereign, independent adult that is capable of operating in the world. The ego doesn't know how to hold itself true to the full nature of its inner being and its core system and construct. So the ego flails in the face of having to operate in the world in a sound, grounded, normative sort of manner. An ego doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know how to do it. And in that, it lives in a constant state of fear. One of the things that's widely recognized about the ego is terrified of its own full spiritual structure and form. And it doesn't really have the capacity to deal with the fullness of its own existence. So the ego is a mental body construct operating in a very limited form and in a very limited manner. And because it lives in fear, that which it doesn't want to integrate with, that which it doesn't want to perceive, becomes the very thing that it belittles and invalidates around. It's this inversion concept, you know. Instead, an ego will purport this grandiose or pretend to be this exalted kind of human, whereas the reality is the inversion of this. They are not grandiose, they are not exalted. And so we see that inversion pattern at play. Because the ego operates in this inverted manner, the ego cannot do the things that it does not value. So you can give all of your time and space and attention and focus and all of these good resources to an ego. And the ego will receive those in the moment, but they're never good enough for the ego. So even when you bring your best dishes to its table, they swipe left. They just ignore it as if it hasn't happened or it hasn't occurred. It's this constant state of not good enough. And again, this is the inversion. The ego deeply within its core nature feels like it is not good enough. And therefore, that is the pattern that it plays out in the world. But it doesn't play that pattern out to its detriment. It plays that pattern out to the detriment of others, because it can't perceive itself. It doesn't want to see itself. It doesn't want to deal with itself. It doesn't want to learn or expand, grow or operate. And something that you'll often hear about when it comes to the ego is that the ego is like the spiritual child who doesn't want to deal with, who doesn't want to acknowledge, and who will tell itself narratives like, I don't have to, it's not me, it's everybody else. All of these are very typical patterns and stereotypical patterns that we see within this kind of psychological structure. Egos often assume that the field of time will just come around for them. Like they can have a thought, like they can put that thought out there, and that thought will just manifest. All they have to do is wait. This is where the narratives come in. This is when we've spoken about the ego as prescripting, premeditative. They project narratives, stories, and events onto people. This is why it occurs, because the ego is not doing anything with its spiritual self, but waiting. It's sitting around waiting for things to happen. It's like the ego is like, I ordered this, 4 months ago and it hasn't happened yet. Why hasn't it happened? And they put that sort of pressure and force field on those around. Everybody in the ego's life and world is an externalized part of self, because the ego cannot identify its true nature. It cannot identify its true form. So it sees itself, it experiences itself through others. Others get a narrative. They get a place in the empire of the ego. And the ego is the emperor of its empire. So nobody is equal to it. In this way, we can say that the ego is very passive because it's waiting for things to happen. And in its passivity, it's very negative. We can also suggest that the devil makes work for idle hands comes into play here, because without having something better to do with itself, the ego has a very toxic effect on its environment. And you have to acknowledge as well that this all leads into a very low quality life experience for the ego. It's not like an ego is having a great time. It's very stressful for an ego if you are lying a lot, distorting reality, gaslighting, invalidating, all of these sorts of things. That's a lot of narratives and scripts to be keeping a hold of within the inner self. If an ego is even trying to keep the house of cards afloat within its own life and world. But life for the ego really is a hall of mirrors. It's about what comes back for it. It's about what it perceives. The ego literally lives through the life force vitality that the external provides to it. So the ego has no capacity to move itself within itself. It has very little capacity to generate its own good mood, its own good emotions, its own good thoughts, its own good feelings. It's not in control of itself. It's not living as an empowered being. It might perceivably be an empowered being because it is taking power off others. But the truth is, sitting in the nature of its soul from the ego's perspective, it is not an empowered being. The ego, similarly, has a very low value of quality of life. The ego doesn't appreciate the things that happen. The ego wants a pair of shoes, wants a pair of shoes, wants a pair of shoes. And as soon as the ego gets a pair of shoes, they are unfulfilling, they are unsatisfying. They don't appreciate things, they don't appreciate good conversation, they don't appreciate deep, enriching emotional connections. But that's not to say that they don't have a depth to their core and to their being. One of the things about our spiritual system is that it cycles around us and within us a lot. You can't escape that which you are. And this is no different for an ego. An ego will very much, scramble within itself. It will have these moments of fear. It'll have moments of anxiety, loneliness, but fear really. So if an ego is living in fear quite a lot, it's living in the darkness. It's living in shroud. It seems like it's, living the high life or, being the top tier of the castle. But the reality is that it's living in the dungeons. It's dark, it's lonely, it's afraid, it doesn't know what to do. Egos generally don't even have so much as a candlelight in front of them to be able to, illuminate the way, because they're fundamentally so fearful of reality, the truth of existence, the fullness of their being and their form. So the reality for the ego is nothing to be envying anyways. The ego is always looking to search and scan. It's always looking to drag and drop, copy and paste what it wants, take from the world around it. And yet this is all happening in the internal headspace of an ego. Their conscious form is not always, and I would suggest often not, really in control of what's truly going on. The ego is not a conscious being. It doesn't realize that it's conscious. It doesn't monitor or have much awareness of what its consciousness is doing. The ego will have a low vibration narrative or thought for somebody. And if you were to point that out to them at any time, they would deny it, because their point of perception is not in tune with their point of reality. And there's a real disharmony and a discordance that happens there. It's very uncomfortable when a person is living so mentally disconnected from themselves. The ego sees others as an extension of its external world. So the ego will often treat other people as if it is engaging and interacting with its own aura. But the ego treats the external as itself. So it's very disconnected, very discombobulated within the system. It's not grounded. So if you think about it, you have this inner structure which is always negatively energy dropping itself in the external, which creates low value ingredients for that when it comes recycled around again. And isn't that what people who are living under the influence of the ego is really doing? We are holding their recycling bin for as long as we do, and we force the ego to move within their own psychology. We force the ego to take on new narratives and new stories because the ego now realizes that they cannot move their energy system through our energy system anymore. Not that the ego would be able to comprehend it like that, but there is that element of self that is instinctive. We instinctively feel our intuitive knowledge and our intuitive knowing, and the ego will get the message even though it won't understand that message. The ego as a negative system is always pushing chi away. Life force vitality, life energy, the simple basic skills, whether it's enjoyment of a moment, whether it's being able to bring a good attitude or, a happy, positive vibration to a situation. The ego can't do these things, and it also can't value these things. So the ego is always pushing high level, positive experiences or chi away from the self. And again, this concept of it goes through the recycling system. So that means that it's always pushing low value energy out. So it's going to be getting even lower value energy back, which is all that it's going to have to move itself forward, which is going to be recycled to come back to itself. So that's today's conversation about some considerations about what life is like for an ego, where they're coming from, their experience, their perception. Please let me know if you found this useful. If you like it, hit the like button. If you'd like to subscribe and support the channel, I'd really appreciate that. Send me a comment, let me know your thoughts, what you'd like to know about next, and let's get into dialogue and see what it is that you would like to deal with. So I will talk to you guys again, look after yourselves, and chat with you soon.